Okay, so I think we'll get started now. Hi everyone, and welcome to our first webinar of the year. Thank you for registering, and we're very grateful to have you all here. So first we'll hear from Stav introducing the EIJI, and then we're lucky to have Luca with us to speak about his project with EDRi and his experience researching with us. We'll also have some time at the end for a Q&A, and we'll also hear from Lily about recruitment opportunities this year at the end. So if I can hand over to Stav.
Thank you very much, Eliza. I'm just going to add the spotlight. And it's lovely to see all of you here. As Eliza mentioned, this event is being recorded, but if you would like to show your lovely faces and your smiles, it would be great so that we can also kind of gauge where we're at as we're going along and continue the conversation. So I'm Stav, I'm the director of the EIJI, or the Edinburgh International Justice Initiative, and we're quite a young initiative. We're running into our third year at the moment, but despite that, we have been involved with a range of issues and organizations across the world. We really got started because we saw that there was a gap in the international justice system, right? Where local NGOs on the ground were not able to get the amount of support that they needed to carry out their work. And at the same time, we noticed that students in the classroom in Edinburgh really lack the experience of applying all of the skills and knowledge that they learned. And so we wanted to kind of bridge that and be able to help NGOs that work on the ground with international issues while providing these students with experience of carrying out legal research. And really, as I mentioned, despite the fact that we're quite young, we managed to work with a lot of very different partners around the world as well, including the ICC Defense Council, several governments and NGOs working with issues from privacy rights, as we'll be talking about today, to atrocities and torture. And we'll also hear, as Eliza mentioned from Lily at the end, about how you can get involved with all of these issues this year, where we will be having 7 new projects and also expanding the type of research that we carry out. So alongside the legal research that we will be hearing about today from Luca, we also carry out digital evidence verification, and recently have also started carrying out stakeholder interviews. And so being involved with the EIJI will really allow you to get involved with all of these kinds of research as well, alongside making a real difference. I will hand over to Luca now. Luca worked with the European Digital Rights and will tell us a little bit more about that project, where they really looked at the rise of biometric mass surveillance in 3 different jurisdictions of the EU. And he will really tell us a bit more about that and about the international impact that his work has had.
Right, thank you, Stav. Before I get on with my presentation, I just wanted to introduce myself very quickly. I'm Luca. I joined EIJI as a summer researcher back in 2020. Following my stint as a researcher, I eventually became research coordinator, which led me to this very interesting project that I'm going to share with you now. If I can, whoops, let's share that. And let's also start that up. Right. Bear with me for just a hot minute. Right, cool. There we are. There's my face for a quick second there. So what I wanted to begin with, and the way I'll kind of divide this up, is I'll just explain briefly what a legal researcher at EIJI tends to do. Then I will go into the details of the project we did with EDRi, break down the approach we took, identify its significance, and then also towards the end, I'll show you a little sample of a little bit of research we did that I think might be quite interesting. So I think one of the first things to note about being a researcher with the EIJI is that no day is really the same. Projects go through various phases, and there's dips and adjustments to be made in regards to, of course, we all have our own lives and our own and other priorities outside of the EIJI, and the EIJI has always been quite accommodating in terms of, well, being able to both juggle work and uni. So around 5 to 15 hours a week is my ballpark figure for how much work it would involve as a researcher. And tasks would include things like open source investigation and research. That's of course in the title, but throughout the process, you'll find that we take a very methodical approach to our research that involves a lot of logging and discussing the findings with the team. There's also the drafting stages, which also oftentimes includes a little bit of peer review. So there's always a little bit of back and forth, not just between between researchers, and it's not just a hierarchical being told what to do and then acting like a drone sort of situation. And oftentimes there's a lot of meetings. We have supervisors on every project, and supervisors are professionals who know what they're talking about and can give us a little nudge in the right direction where needed. And I find that the involvement of supervisors has really helped with seeing a lot of personal growth, both in myself and with the teams I've led over the years, well, over the year, as it were. So that takes us to the EDRi project. Now, European Digital Rights, EDRi for short, is a network of around 45 different NGOs, and their focus tends to be on digital rights, freedom of expression, privacy, data protection, that sort of thing. The final product was a 160-page report, but that included 3 different countries. So it has now been published, and it's been used for EDRi's. So keep in mind, this is EDRi's, not ours, not our campaign, to ban biometric mass surveillance. Now, since its publication, it's been featured in Politico. MEPs in Brussels have done their own press releases in response to it. It's been used by EDRi's work campaigning for digital rights within Europe, and it's also being shown to policymakers, which include the European Data Protection Supervisor. So all of that is within the 3 months of its publication, and it's going to continue to be used once the EU now kind of comes out of its sort of summer pause, as it were. So that's quite a big impact for the work of some students at Edinburgh, and I have to say, I'm quite proud of the work. All of the researchers I've worked with really enjoyed it, and they get to see now that all of what they've done has now come to fruition and is being used in a very real way. And I think that's probably one of the most rewarding and most interesting parts of being with the EIJI. Now, the project itself, I'm going to now describe that somewhat. And essentially, they wanted a 3 country reports on biometric mass processing. So anything that involved biometric surveillance on a mass scale, the collection and processing of that data in an indiscriminate way. So we had to like shift out things like individual in instances where you like unlock your phone with your thumb. That's not really mass surveillance necessarily. So there was, first of all, a point of prioritization. And in terms of the actual task, having discussed with EDRi, we came to this particular sort of breakdown, which is a general analysis of various deployments. We could have done, for example, only facial recognition or only one thing, but we had enough flexibility, for example, to identify various ones and then use that in our report in varying levels of detail. And then principally, EDRi wanted us to look at European law. However, we also decided it was possible to look at national law as well. And given the international nature of Edinburgh Uni, we had people on the team who spoke all of the languages of the countries we were looking at. So we had a Dutch speaker, we had a Polish speaker, and we had I'm German, so I spoke German, and those were the 3 countries we looked at. So incidentally, that worked out quite well. So the first stage we set out to do was to fact find. We looked at news articles, we looked at press releases by governments and different companies. We looked at FOI requests that were sent out. We looked at different government bodies' activities, what their policies were, who their partners were, who they had contracts with. And we also looked a lot at the private sector, since, at least for this project, we knew that there was a huge amount of cooperation between private and public bodies. Private bodies tend to brag a lot more about what they do. So we found that there was a lot more of a wealth of findings, at least in terms of open source things we could find on different websites, such as the people who produce the cameras, who develop the software. They like to list their partners, list what they're capable of, not always fully with legal ramifications in mind, but that was, of course, for the analysis. EDRi also supplied us with contacts with experts in the field who knew a thing or two about each individual country. So there was a very constant collaborative process of finding information, finding facts, finding connections between facts as well. And that was sort of the first phase of this project. The second was the classic legal research. Now, that firstly involved domestic legislation. Most countries did have English translations of all of their sort of statutes, essentially, since they're all civil jurisdictions. We only really had to look through their civil code, essentially, which was straightforward enough. But there was also some case law as well, and other sorts of government reports and different sort of domestic level discussions that were happening that could also give us a more fleshed out picture of what the legal landscape in regards to biometric mass surveillance in those countries were. Going a level up, we looked at the EU and European Court of Human Rights level. So that includes, of course, treaties, regulations like the GDPR and the Law Enforcement Directive, lots of case law and lots of reports. And that also bled over into the international side. So the UN Special Rapporteur on privacy did some very interesting work that we looked through. There were general comments on rights of privacy in the digital age that we looked at. Again, some case law and of course, treaties, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Sort of once you gather everything that is relevant to the concept of biometric mass surveillance, there has to be a bit of a filtering process that occurs after. So what's on point? What is exactly what we're looking for? What's partially or abstractly relevant and what's just not going to work? So that's a very important point at that stage, since prioritization is just as much a factor of research as discovery, let's say. And then the final step is to essentially apply those findings. So we have facts, we have law, we have to now see how those facts fit within that framework. The key question when you look at a fact is to ask yourself, so what? Why is this important? What are the implications of it? Now, direct rules are very easily applied, but for this project, there wasn't exactly much purely on point, although there were some very strong general principles that we identified. The most important bits, and I should probably stress that EIJI is an apolitical organization. So we focus a lot more on the questions that facts raise rather than trying to prescribe a particular answer to those facts and to those questions. So objectiveness is very important there, and party politics is something to be avoided in its entirety. There's no space for it here. Essentially, what we had to do was identify where something a state has done raises a legal question, but not go any further than to prescribe a particular solution, but still to diagnose an issue. And I think the best way I can probably do that is by giving you all a little bit of an example. Now, so this was a part of our German research. We looked at the city of Köln, so Cologne, and we essentially had to figure out the extent of facial recognition surveillance. Not just facial recognition surveillance, but also facial recognition, tongue twister, surveillance that could also reach far deeper than simply one's face, be able to identify someone, look at their contacts, identify things that go far beyond what a regular CCTV camera can do. Now, in order to get a better picture, we had to look at some very populated areas. So we looked at Breslauer Platz in different parts of the city. So what we have on the map here is firstly a city map obtained from the Cologne City Council. Then we we obtained the camera locations via an FOI that was sent to the Cologne City Police. And so those black dots are cameras. And we cross-referenced the locations of those cameras with what was actually in that area, which included things like gay clubs and mosques and churches. Now, under the GDPR, sexuality and religion or data pertaining to those things is essentially a special category of data. So there's our legal relevance as well. So in those cases, there's already heightened protections that are expected. So we already identified that that was already an issue that was going to have to go into the report. In the surveillance, we had to look at what those cameras even were. So we looked at some pictures from Street View, we looked at different reports by NGOs and articles that were being pushed out, as well as was mostly relevant here, a spokesperson for, I believe, for the local city council, who said that they've been using these very wonderful cameras. So we looked into what those cameras were, and we found that they were called Panomera, which is a range of cameras produced by a company called Dallmayr. Now, Dallmayr advertised, so we found their website, we found the cameras had matched the models and the images we found, and then we also found what those cameras were capable of. Essentially, we found that they were capable of live biometric processing. You didn't need to have someone get a feed and then run it through software at the end, although that is still within the scope of our report. One could be identified live without any human impact. So there's any human input. So there was already quite a very deep ranging, let's say, sort of an intrusive elements to the use of these cameras and how they operated. So we definitely flagged that as quite important. And we had sort of detailed out in our report, first of all, what the cameras were, who was providing them, the software that they were using, which could also be fed through a regular CCTV camera, although these cameras, as we found, included chips that could process information all live. So that's something I particularly found relevant. Now, that's an example of one small slice of the research we did. Our research went well beyond, so we looked at different parts of the city, we looked at surveillance at the federal level, at the state level, and then also at the border level, and to see how all of that fit together. And I think the most rewarding part of doing this research was the fact that eventually all of these different puzzle pieces started to come together. We started to have a much clearer picture of what was going on, where at the beginning, it seemed quite overwhelming. So I think this is a good example of the really good work our researchers have done and of what you can expect to kind of experience as an EIJI researcher. So I suppose I can now go into why I think being an EIJI researcher is a very great experience. Now, I think the first thing to be said off the bat is that these are real projects. The clients are real organizations that will need your research for their work. And on the basis that this is for essentially either an international or important human rights NGO, that work tends to be quite interesting. It tends to be very compelling, and it tends to engage questions of justice, of the role between individuals and the state, and questions of accountability more broadly. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, there will always be very interesting work going around. And I think it's also very well suited for people who are very naturally curious. So if you're a bit nosy, this is definitely something that can help sharpen your skills in that area. I think it's just a wonderful thing to see the research you do over the course of a semester or over the course of a year take fruition from a concept that you discuss with your team to research that you're starting to implement, to eventually something very, very real that has then been published and been looked at by real people. And in the process of doing that, you can get feedback from professional supervisors, and you can start to develop not just basic finding skills of just Googling something or looking through Westlaw. You actually develop very high level research skills. And that always is good for your CV. And I think I already mentioned that the topics are quite interesting. So I will sort of cap it at that for now. And I believe we have some time for questions. I believe it. We'll be doing that. That sort of concludes my presentation though. So I think we'll switch back to just looking at my face.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Luca. That was extremely interesting and a little bit scary, if you ask me, seeing the work that you've done. So I've got a few questions of my own, and then if anyone wants to put any questions they have in the chat box, they can be asked at the end for you. So my first question is, what would you say your biggest challenges were as you faced during your time working on the project? It was obviously quite a large scale project. You had a lot of stuff to work through and lots of information you needed to make your way through and working with international companies. So what were the challenges?
Yeah, I think you spotted the issue right there. And that is sort of sifting through a whole load of information and identifying what is and what isn't important. It was quite easy to feel a bit overwhelmed at certain points, but keeping a method up quite helped with that. I also think it was a bit of wasn't necessarily fully a challenge in the end, but I think it was quite important that we didn't step on too many political toes and kept the project fully apolitical, particularly where we're essentially looking at state behavior and seeing, essentially, not exactly pointing a finger, but identifying a real issue that arises no matter how one cuts it. So it's at the, no matter how you cut it, that's an issue stage that you want to focus on and not speculate or infer anything. And that's always important to do, even when you're working for very, let's say, accountability focused NGOs. They're essentially commissioning you for an objective report, not to do their campaigning work for them. And that's essentially what you have to stick to when you do this kind of thing.
Okay, I can imagine that can be a bit of a challenge there. Your project was also published all over the world, quite a few times. I've looked at all of the articles. So that must be incredibly rewarding, but I wanted to know what you found most rewarding or interesting about this particular project.
I mean, it is nice to see your work, to see the work you ever saw published, but I think the most rewarding part was seeing how the research team developed, since we all kind of started out not being fully immersed in the world of biometric surveillance and all that. But bit by bit, as the researchers continued their work, I saw them ask questions and think critically about the world in an increasingly advanced way. The things we found and the way we cross-referenced all the different information we found was just really rewarding to see people progress and get really good at it. And you know, starting out as very bright students and ending up as, well, high-level researchers capable of producing such work was a beautiful thing, to be honest.
I can imagine, yeah. And also, the wider vision of the Edinburgh International Justice Initiative is of an international justice system that effectively ensures justice for all. And how would you say that your work with EDRi relates to that?
Well, I believe that the focus on biometric mass surveillance is essentially one of wanting to avoid a police state, wanting to avoid a very subversive kind. It's not necessarily the same kind of atrocity crimes one might traditionally associate with international justice, but it certainly is something that leads to an undermining of rights. So what we found, for example, in our analysis, we identified a threat to the right to protest. If you're likely to be observed constantly, then you're less likely to exercise your rights, even if you're not necessarily fully aware that you're being watched. Just the idea that you might be has an impact. We also identified a lot of algorithmic bias in terms of race that a lot of the software being deployed tends to use. So being able to identify essentially racist software being used by state bodies was definitely in line with a fairer world, I'd say.
Yeah, I agree. It's something that I think many of us probably haven't really thought of that much before. It's quite eye-opening, actually. Now, I wanted to go on to talk more about the EIJI itself. And I was just wondering, what was it that drew you to working with them, to choose them as an institute?
Well, I found myself in the summer of 2020 without much of a very strong purpose. As many of you might know, especially those going into third year at the time, so all of my fellow graduates had essentially had all of the VAC schemes evaporate. It was a time where I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do with myself. And then I saw that EDRi posted that they were looking for researchers. The mission resonated with me far more than a commercial VAC scheme did. And I'm a naturally nosy person. I thought I could kind of deploy my nosiness at least to be somewhat helpful in that regard. And then it kind of snowballed on from there. I joined, I had my interview. I got on quite well with everyone at EIJI, and I really liked the kind of familial attitude. It was very collegial. It was very warm. So I kind of warmed up with everyone, made some really good friends who I still spam on the daily these days. And that just kind of snowballed into what it kind of is now, with me being sort of merged at the hip. And I'm quite sad that I've now graduated and can't take part anymore, but it's definitely been one of the highlights of my undergrad, I'd say.
Yeah, it's a lovely team from what I've seen so far. And yeah. So also, you were through the initiative, you were working with a large international organisation such as EDRi, and they work with, as you said, 45 NGOs, experts, academics. I'd find that a bit intimidating, but what was it like working with them?
I felt that intimidation to a certain extent to it as well, especially at the beginning. And I think it was quite important to remind myself that they knew that we were students and this is what they were commissioning us to do. So it's important to have some confidence in your ability. In terms of what it's like working with a group that large, I'd say the most important thing to keep in mind, for me at least, when I was coordinating the research, was to make sure that all of the interests that they have are accommodated. So different groups will have slightly different perspectives on more niche issues. So oftentimes the solution we'd find was to keep our framing fairly general, but also to cross-reference with, at least, let's say, if we're looking at a certain country, then that narrows down the number of organizations that actually really have a huge opinion on that, but that still is a certain amount. So in terms of facts, that's a bit easier to deal with. In terms of policy analysis and legal analysis, that was a little trickier. So there were some topics that weren't fully resolved, and naturally are never going to, there's always going to be something that isn't fully agreed upon as things develop until it eventually resolves itself. But so there was a few topics we just tended to keep on the shelf for the time being and focused on, because also given if we focus on every single topic out there, the report would have been a lot more than 160 pages. So in that sense, prioritization and homogenizing what you find with what the client is, what they want, takes a certain amount of time, I'd say. So that was perhaps a bit new, but still it was quite interesting. But you just have to do a little bit of extra diligence on that front.
Yeah, thank you for that. Another question I have is for potentially people thinking of joining the EIJI was it difficult to maintain a balance between working as a researcher and working towards your degree, because you were in your 4th year of a law degree, I think. So I can imagine that's not light work either.
Yeah, I think anyone who knows me personally will know that I love a full plate. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There was definitely a lot of work going on. And I think the pandemic aspect also had a bit of a role to play in that I was looking for ways to fill my time. But I also find that I tend to be a lot more unproductive if I have a lot of time to be idle. So I particularly thought that upon reflection, at least now that I've kind of come out of the woods, that having done EIJI alongside my studies kept my mind quite sharp. It was quite a good way of keeping myself quite curious and at least very methodical. I tended to apply a lot of the things I'd learned in a very abstract sense, from my EIJI work to my studies. So I'd have a more critical mind in a certain way, since I was always prodding things from a lot of different angles. That definitely helped my academics. It also kind of forced me somewhat to be very, very organized throughout to keep myself afloat, but it wasn't something that detracted or made me feel overwhelmed at any particular point. But it was definitely a good amount of heat, but nothing that would burn, I'd say.
That's very interesting, actually. I'm thinking of it running alongside your studies. It must have been quite a nice combination with your law degree as well. And finally, I wanted to ask what advice you'd give others interested in working as both a researcher with the EIJI or working towards a law degree, because there may be some people here that are working towards that.
Wait, you cut out for a quick second there. Could you repeat that?
Oh, sorry. I wanted to know what advice you had for those wanting to research for the EIJI and also wanting to work towards a law degree.
Right. Okay, 3 things come to mind on that one. On the first, I'd say be confident in your ability. I think a lot of issues in general, not just within EIJI, but broadly, when students tend to hop onto very real things, there's a lot of second guessing that goes on. And I think trust in your ability to essentially read, think, and write, since that is sort of the core skill base that you have. And it's important not to get yourself too down, particularly at the beginning, since you'd be surprised what you can do with just a little bit of free time and a curious mind and a capacity to just kind of go down a rabbit hole, essentially. There's a lot of potential there, and I've seen people who were already at first a little bit unsure about how they do eventually become very capable. The second thing I'd say is to develop your own system of self-management. I think it's very easy to get a little overwhelmed by things, and the best sort of port of call for yourself there is to break things down in the way you know how to manage your time and your attention in a way that lets you breathe. Because if you're not necessarily if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, or if you don't necessarily have like uni going on, you have friends to sort of attend to, and then you also have EIJI, there's some obligations that are very real across all of those, but also you have a client with the EIJI they also have to take care of. That warrants a level of organization that is relatively high, but nothing that I would say there's a single prescribed way of dealing with it. The most important thing is that that system works for you. And the last thing I'd say is take care of yourself. Have a breather, take a break, have some herbal tea, whatever it is you need to do to unwind a little bit, do it. Because you cannot really give to any project if you yourself are burnt out and empty. That is something I always stress, because if you go down that route, you're not going to help anyone. You're not going to help the client, you're not going to help yourself. You're going to feel sleep deprived and tired, and you're going to feel miserable, and no one really wants that. So it's important to also keep some self-care up, to be able to say work stops at this time, and then do just that, because otherwise, it defeats the purpose and also doesn't result in good work. So why do it?
Thank you. That sounds like some extremely good advice that everyone should be listening to. So that's it from my questions, but I think we have a few in the chat from everyone, if you'd be happy to answer some of them.
Yep.
So the first one we have is from Ben, and he says, does the EIJI have or is looking to develop long-term partnerships with organisations for ongoing research projects, or do they prefer to work on a case-by-case basis? I don't know if that is a question for you, or maybe Stav as well, if you wanted to.
I'm happy to chip in a little bit as well here. And thank you so much for the presentation, Luca. It was amazing. And thank you for the questions as well, Eliza. So we do both, Ben. We both work on long-term partnerships with certain partners, such as the Cameroon Database for Atrocities, for example, which we carry out digital evidence verification for, but we also just carry out semester-long or year-long projects that are more standalone with clients. Sometimes clients need more ongoing help, and sometimes they have specific projects that they need additional legal research support with. So it really does depend on a case-by-case basis, but I think it's nice both to discover new clients, but also to kind of continue and maintain relationships, and we do try to do both. Hope that answered your question, Ben.
Yes, thank you, Stav. Our next question from the chat is from Lily, but Lily, would you like to ask the question yourself?
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much, Luca. It was lovely to hear your experience at the initiative. So my question was really along the lines of, you were talking about you've graduated now. And so what do you think is the main thing that you'll take forward from your experience at EIJI into your future?
I think one of the main things I've gotten out of it was a very strong, much stronger confidence in my ability than I had before. I wasn't, if you told me in first year that I'd be talking to representatives from different NGOs on a bi-weekly basis, meeting with qualified lawyers to discuss my findings and leading a team at the same time, I'd probably shriek and faint. And now I'd only shriek. So I think an important takeaway is that working with the EIJI and working on these real projects definitely helped sharpen both my, the classic research skills that are relevant and the organizational skills relevant to leading a team and all of that. But I think it's become somewhat of a theme in what I've been saying is that you become quite sure of your ability to do things. So now I know how to handle client expectations. I know how to negotiate around gray areas and deal with things on my own without always having to sort of ask for help or feel like I'm not too much of an imposter. The imposter syndrome is essentially gone. And I don't feel like I have much of a need to have that return, since I've seen the fruits of my labor and quite happy with them, to be honest. So I'm going to take that forward.
That's great. Thank you. And the last question we have in our chat is from Daisy. And she wanted to ask if there were any projects and areas of international justice that you'd like to get involved with in the future.
So things I would personally want to get involved with. So I think I've kind of developed a little bit of a niche specialty in everything to do with data and surveillance and information. So that's always going to be, I think, a theme in my life, and that's just kind of it. Although I will say that I've kind of gotten into a lot of environmental work at the minute as well, more so that I've been following it right now, because environmental justice is something that I think none of us can really ignore. And it does present a somewhat new and unfamiliar legal playing field for me, because it's such an interdisciplinary area. But I've been reading up on some, I think I have a book somewhere here as well. Oh yeah, Letters to the Earth, which is introduced by Emma Thompson. But point being is I'm kind of getting my head around the issues at the minute. I think there's always a kind of stage where you first get a sense of what's out there before you look at all the black letter rules and then get into acting. But I'd definitely say that in terms of international justice, my two big interests at the minute are information and the environment.
Thank you. I've also got a question from Stav, where she says, you mentioned that you worked with an international team who could access jurisdictions and policy documents we may not usually have access to as students from Edinburgh. And what do you feel you learned from that experience?
In terms of, yeah, well, I think on one hand, I got to see a wide range of skills I didn't possess. So I think when you work with EIJI and you become an RC, you'll see some really capable people and they're now going to rely on you for some guidance. But then you also have to realize that you're not some kind of master researcher in any sense. You are someone who's familiar with the work, have the ethic to do it and all of that. So I think that something that kind of surprised me was sort of seeing all of these different skills and not just language skills, for example. That's of course one thing. I also saw different ways of thinking, different ways of pulling apart information, organizational skills and drafting skills, and I think peer review also really helped with that. And in terms of other things, yeah, I mean, it was definitely interesting to see some of the discussions we had as well amongst ourselves about how to take things forward. So we try to keep things very democratic. But of course, occasionally you do have to sort of give a nudge in a certain direction, or say that that's going a little too much into the political. But working with such a broad team, I mean, I should also probably note that just because you don't necessarily speak a billion languages and do all that doesn't mean that you're in any way sort of limited, because I think one great example was one of our researchers didn't speak any of the languages that we were researching, but he still found some of the most, he was still one of the most hard work. He definitely found a lot. And that kind of surprised us all because he was very resourceful. He would pop things to the Google Translate or consult with people, with his teammate who did speak the language, just to double check that his translations were correct enough to get the gist. He'd eventually picked up different words in the language so that he could scan through and filter out documents that were not helpful. So I think that's probably one of the coolest things I saw. I kind of veered off question there. Is that enough stuff? Or, yeah, okay, cool.
Okay, that's great. I think I just thought of one more question.
Yeah.
Would be, do you feel that it's not a massive disadvantage not to be a student of law, to be a member of the EIJI as well? Speaking as a School of Economics girl as well.
Oh, I definitely have seen, I mean, there's no real disadvantage, I'd say. I mean, on one hand, it's to be said that law students spend a lot of their time looking at case law and legislation and all of that to know how to navigate it. But there are other skill sets that other disciplines sort of provide that I think a lot of law students can sometimes underestimate. And I've particularly seen some of the best sort of analysis and most critical thinking I've found was from different disciplines. So I wouldn't be able to say that there is a substantial difference in quality from what they churn out. I think they're different, but neither is better or worse. And I think a great thing about an EIJI research team is that it has a bit of a rich depth. In particularly the last project we did, there was a good sort of, I think there was some people had studied politics, so there was a certain understanding of political currents that allowed us to not just say that's a political current, but also say we're going a little too deep into that. There's an implication to using those words there that we should probably best avoid. And that's not something every law student will necessarily always be aware of. And also in terms of just general skills, I mean, yes, all the case stuff is one thing, but that can also be taught. And research coordinators are always happy to sit down with you and sort of go through the technical side of things. What really matters is a critical mind and discipline and a bit of creativity, I'd say, as well. And those aren't things that are exclusive to law students by any means.
Okay, thank you. Being able to get all the different skills from different fields is probably quite useful and unique. So unless anyone else has any questions, I think we can say thank you to Luca so much for a brilliant presentation, some great answering to some questions, great questions from everyone who's joined us. And if we could now go to Lily, who is going to tell us a little bit about recruitment opportunities that are coming up this year for the EIJI.
Yeah, perfect. And I will just put the links, there we go, in the chat again for everyone. So I won't take up too much of your time, but just really, if you haven't seen, we are recruiting for both legal researchers and research coordinators, and the links for those applications in the chat. The applications will close on Friday, so have a look if you're interested. Anyone who is a matriculated student at the University of Edinburgh, doesn't matter your degree, the year, your background, we're really just interested in everyone who wants to play a part in some research into some really interesting international justice areas. We have teams of 4 to 6 researchers led by a research coordinator. The projects will be both semester long or year long, depending on what you feel you can give. And yeah, so we'd love to see some applications coming through. And really, whether it's your first ever research project and you're very new, or whether you're an experienced researcher, we have a place for you at the initiative. So yeah, and I think unless Stav has anything to say, I'm happy to hang around at the end when we stop the recording if anyone has any questions that they would want to ask. So yeah, thank you all for coming.
That's great. Thank you, Lily. Thank you everyone for coming and attending our first webinar. We'll hopefully be having more of these coming up throughout the year. And I think Lily also put in the chat our social media links as well. And through our Facebook page, you can also find the link to sign up to our mailing letter if you want to sign up to receive a nice monthly newsletter to be updated on everything that we're doing, more links to these events as well. So thank you, Luca, thank you, Lily, thank you, Stav, thank you, everyone else, and we'll see you soon, hopefully.